The week we call holy was not celebrated, it was survived. That is the first thing history demands we understand. Before the palm branches, before the Last Supper, before the trial in the middle of the night, there was a city bracing itself. A city that smelled of fear and animal blood, and unwashed thousands pressing against one another in narrow alleys carved from limestone. A city that had learned, through generations of occupation and violence, that certain weeks were not occasions for joy. They were occasions for caution. Jerusalem in the days before Passover was not the Jerusalem of our devotional paintings. Serene, luminous, bathed in golden light, it was loud, it was dangerous, it was suffocating. And for the men and women who moved through its streets in that particular spring, in that particular year, it was a week unlike any they had lived before, though they could not yet know exactly why. To understand what happened during those 7 days, you have to understand what kind of city Jerusalem became when Passover arrived. You have to understand the pressure, the density, the weight of it all. If you've ever found yourself reading the Passion narratives and feeling that something is missing, some texture, some gravity that the words alone cannot carry, then stay until the end. Because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels entirely. Passover was the most important pilgrimage feast in the Jewish calendar. The Torah commanded every Jewish male who was physically able to appear before God in Jerusalem 3 times a year, for Passover, for Shavuot, and for Sukkot. But Passover was the one that moved the most people. It commemorated the Exodus, the founding trauma and triumph of the entire nation. It was the moment God had reached into history and pulled an enslaved people out of the grip of an empire. And so every year, in the weeks before the 14th of Nisan, the roads that led to Jerusalem began to fill. They came from Galilee in the north, walking for 3 to 5 days. They came from Perea on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They came from the diaspora, from Alexandria, from Babylon, from Rome, from Antioch. Some of them making journeys of weeks or months to be present in the holy city for these 8 days. Historians who have studied ancient sources, including the Jewish historian Josephus, have estimated that Jerusalem's population during Passover swelled to anywhere between 200,000 and 600,000 people. The city's permanent population was perhaps 30,000. Consider what that means physically. Consider what it means for water, for food, for space to sleep, for sanitation, for the price of everything. The city's infrastructure groaned under the weight of it. The upper market, normally a place of relative order, became a crush of bodies and voices and competing currencies. The money changers, whose presence in the temple courts Jesus would confront, existed not out of greed alone, but out of structural necessity. Roman coins bore the image of Caesar, which made them ritually inappropriate for temple offerings. Pilgrims who had walked for days carrying Roman denarii needed to exchange their money for the Tyrian shekel, the only currency accepted for the temple tax. The exchange rate was controlled. The commissions were significant, and the pilgrims, exhausted and disoriented, had little power to negotiate. This is where the week begins, not in triumph, in transaction. The roads into Jerusalem were unpaved in most stretches, compressed earth and loose stone, worn smooth by centuries of sandals and hooves. In the weeks before Passover, the religious authorities sent workers out along these roads to whitewash the tombs that lined the roadsides. This was not an act of beautification. It was a warning. Contact with the dead rendered a person ritually impure, and a pilgrim who accidentally walked too close to an unmarked grave could find himself disqualified from participating in the Passover sacrifice. The white paint was a boundary, a signal. Here is death, do not come close. Jesus would later speak of whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, full of death within. The people who heard him said nothing in response that was recorded. They knew exactly what he meant. They had seen those tombs every time they walked toward the city. The road from Jericho climbed. Jerusalem sat at an elevation of roughly 2,500 feet above sea level. Coming from the Jordan Valley, pilgrims ascended nearly 3,000 feet over the course of a day's walk. Their legs ached. Their waterskins grew light. The city appeared on the ridge above them. First the upper stories of the temple, white stone and gold leaf catching the morning sun, visible from miles away. It was deliberately constructed to be seen from a distance, to announce itself, to say, this is the center of the world. And then the descent into the Kidron Valley, the crossing of the brook, the climb up again through the neighborhoods that pressed against the eastern wall. Voices in a dozen languages, vendors selling dried figs and lentils, children too tired to walk being carried on backs, old men with staffs, women with clay water jars balanced on their heads, sheep being driven toward the city, bleating without understanding what awaited them. The smell of Jerusalem during Passover was unlike anything in ordinary life. Smoke from cooking fires, mixing with the sharp, copper-bright smell of blood from the slaughterhouses at the edge of the city, incense burning continuously in the temple, the sour smell of bodies that had been walking for days, animal dung on the stones, and underneath all of it, the dry, ancient smell of limestone, the rock the city was built from, the rock the tombs were cut into, the rock the roads were pressed from. This is the air Jesus breathed when he entered the city. He entered on what we call Palm Sunday, the first day of the week that would end at Golgotha. But the entry itself was not a spontaneous celebration. It was a deliberate, calculated act, loaded with political and prophetic meaning that every person in the crowd understood immediately, even if they understood it differently. He rode on a young donkey. The crowds spread cloaks on the road and cut branches from the trees. They shouted, "Hosanna," a word that meant, in its original sense, "Save us now." Not a word of pure praise, a word of desperation, a plea. For them, salvation was not an abstract theological concept. It was political. It was physical. It was the end of the Roman boot on the neck of the nation. It was the restoration of the Davidic kingdom. When they shouted, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David," they were not speaking in metaphor. They were speaking with the hunger of people who had been occupied for nearly a century, who had watched their relatives die in failed revolts, who paid taxes to a foreign power and watched that money flow west to Rome, while their own children went without. The Passover crowd was a crowd primed for revolution. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate knew it. He had traveled from his usual residence in Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem specifically for Passover, bringing additional troops to prevent exactly the kind of uprising that the season seemed to invite. The memory of the Exodus made people dangerous. It reminded them that liberation was possible, that God had intervened before. Into this crowd, into this charged and desperate air, Jesus rode on a donkey, not a war horse, a donkey. The choice of the donkey was not humility for its own sake. It was a text. Anyone standing along that road who knew the scriptures, and most of them did, because the scriptures were not read privately but recited publicly in synagogues every Sabbath, embedded in the memory of the community from childhood. Anyone standing there recognized immediately what they were seeing. The prophet Zechariah had written it centuries before. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." A king on a donkey was not a king diminished. It was a king arriving in the mode of peace, not conquest. It was a king who had chosen a specific symbol over a specific moment, in a specific city, in front of a specific crowd that was desperate for a specific kind of salvation. The tension in that entry was total. because the crowd wanted one thing, and what Jesus was offering was something they did not yet have the categories to understand. That gap between what the crowd expected and what was actually happening is the hinge on which the entire week turns. After the entry, Jesus went to the temple. Mark's account tells us that on that first evening, he looked around at everything and then left because it was already late. He went back to Bethany, a small village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from the city walls. He and his disciples stayed there each night during the week. They did not stay inside Jerusalem. This is a detail that modern readers tend to pass over without much thought. But it matters enormously when you understand the geography and the social reality of the city during Passover. Inside Jerusalem, there was no room. Every house, every courtyard, every flat roof that could hold a sleeping mat was already occupied. The pilgrims who could afford it rented space from city residents who charged whatever the season would bear. Those who could not afford it camped in the valleys surrounding the city, in the Kidron Valley to the east, in the Hinnom Valley to the south, in the open hillsides of the Mount of Olives. Thousands of people slept under the open sky during Passover week, wrapped in their cloaks, fires burning through the night against the cold that still settled over the Judean hills in early spring. Jesus and the 12 were among those who slept outside the city walls. Bethany was not a place of comfort and retreat. It was the closest village where they could find shelter with people they trusted, specifically the family of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. This was a community of relationship and loyalty, not luxury. Each morning during the week, they made the walk from Bethany back into Jerusalem, over the Mount of Olives, down into the Kidron Valley, up through the gates of the city. About 40 minutes of walking, uphill in one direction, downhill in the other. At the end of each exhausting day in the city, teaching in the temple courts, debating with Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees and Herodians, navigating the crowds, managing the expectations of his own disciples, he walked back. There was no rest in this week, not for him, not for anyone. The temple was the center of everything during Passover, and it is impossible to understand what Jesus did there, or why it provoked the response it did, without understanding what the temple actually was. It was not primarily a place of quiet prayer. That image belongs to a different religious world. The temple in Jerusalem was a slaughterhouse, a bank, a courthouse, a government building, and a house of worship simultaneously. It was the largest religious complex in the ancient world. Herod the Great had spent decades and extraordinary amounts of money expanding and beautifying it, creating a platform that covered approximately 35 acres of ground. The outer court, called the Court of the Gentiles, was open to everyone regardless of ethnic or religious background. It was massive, noisy, and perpetually crowded. In this outer court, during Passover, the commercial activity that Jesus disrupted was fully operational. Animals for sacrifice were sold there. Doves for the poor, lambs for those of moderate means, larger animals for those who could afford them. The money changers operated their tables. The volume of transactions during Passover week was staggering. Josephus records figures, likely exaggerated but pointing toward the scale, of hundreds of thousands of animals sacrificed during the feast. Each one purchased, each purchase requiring currency exchange, each exchange generating revenue. When Jesus overturned the tables and drove out the animals, it was not a moment of spontaneous anger. Mark tells us he had visited the temple the evening before and looked around at everything. He had seen it all. He had gone back to Bethany. He had returned the next morning having made a decision. The action was deliberate, and its immediate consequences were severe. The chief priests and the scribes, the men who administered the temple and who derived both income and authority from its operation, began immediately looking for a way to kill him. Mark writes this plainly, without drama. They wanted him dead. And their reason was not purely theological. It was institutional. What he had done threatened the system that sustained their power. This is the world that Holy Week actually inhabited. Not a world of palm branches and triumphant hymns, but a world of money and power and institutional religion defending itself against a man who kept insisting that God had other intentions for his house. Each day that week, Jesus taught in the temple courts, and each day, different groups came to test him, to find a question he could not answer, a position he could not defend, a trap he could not escape. The Pharisees sent their disciples with Herodians, an unusual alliance because Pharisees and Herodians rarely cooperated, to ask him about taxes. Should Jews pay taxes to Caesar? It was a perfect trap. If he said yes, he alienated the crowd who hated Roman taxation. If he said no, he gave the Roman authorities grounds to arrest him for sedition. He asked for a coin, looked at the image stamped on it and said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." The crowd was amazed. His opponents left, but the question lingered in the air longer than the answer did. Because the real question underneath the trap was the one no one asked aloud: what exactly belongs to God? And the implied answer, everything, was more radical than any political position his questioners had imagined. The Sadducees came next with a question about resurrection. They did not believe in resurrection. It was one of the theological points that separated them from the Pharisees. Their question was designed to make the concept look absurd. A woman married 7 brothers in succession, each dying without children. Whose wife would she be in the resurrection? Jesus told them they understood neither the scriptures nor the power of God, and then he turned their own theological tradition against them, citing the passage where God calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, present tense, not past tense, and arguing that you cannot be the God of the dead. A scribe who had been listening came forward and asked which commandment was the greatest. Jesus gave him 2. Love God with everything you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. The scribe agreed and added that these 2 commandments were worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Jesus told him he was not far from the kingdom of God, not far, but not inside it yet either. That exchange with the scribe is one of the quietest and most remarkable moments in the week, precisely because it almost disappeared into the noise. A man who spent his life maintaining the system of temple sacrifice admitted publicly in the temple courts, during the week of the year's most important sacrifice, that love was worth more than the whole apparatus around them. And Jesus did not condemn him. He recognized something real in the man's answer and named it. This is what gets lost when we reduce Holy Week to a liturgical sequence. The week was alive with these moments, small human encounters inside an enormous historical pressure system. A scribe almost stumbling into something true. A crowd cheering without fully understanding what they were cheering for. Disciples arguing about who would be greatest in the coming kingdom, still imagining a kingdom that looked like Rome, but with different rulers. And Jesus moving through all of it, teaching, answering, watching, walking back to Bethany at dusk, his sandals worn from the stone roads, the cold air of the Judean hills settling over the valley, the fires of the pilgrims' camps flickering on the hillsides around him. The week was not holy because it was peaceful. It was holy because of what it cost. By midweek, the city had reached a particular kind of tension that people who have lived under occupation recognize immediately. The tension that comes not from open conflict, but from the awareness that open conflict is very close. Jerusalem during Passover was already a compressed spring. The Roman garrison in the Antonia fortress, built directly adjacent to the Temple Mount, maintained a constant visual presence over the temple courts. Soldiers stood on the parapets and looked down into the crowds below. This was deliberate. The view from the Antonia was strategic, designed so that any disturbance in the outer court could be seen and responded to immediately. Pilate had additional troops stationed throughout the city. The high priest's household maintained its own security. Everyone was watching everyone else. Into this atmosphere of surveillance and suppressed volatility, Jesus continued to teach. But something shifted in the middle of the week. The public confrontations in the temple courts gave way to something more private, more inward. Matthew records a long discourse delivered on the Mount of Olives, on the walk back toward Bethany, when the disciples pointed at the temple buildings and marveled at their size and beauty. Jesus told them that not one stone of those buildings would be left on another. The disciples asked him privately when this would happen and what the sign of his coming would be. What followed was one of the most difficult passages in the Gospels, dense with imagery, contested in its interpretation, spoken in the language of Jewish apocalyptic prophecy that was deeply familiar to first-century ears, but has often been misread by later centuries. But what matters here for understanding the week is the mood of the moment. The disciples sat on the hillside above the Kidron Valley as the sun moved westward over the city. Below them, the temple gleamed. Around them, the smoke of 10,000 cooking fires rose from the pilgrim camps. And Jesus spoke to them about endings. He had spent the week engaged in public combat with the institutions of his world. Now he spoke to his closest companions about what was coming. And what he described was not a triumphant military campaign. It was suffering, betrayal, persecution, the destruction of the very building they were looking at. And the instruction, repeated again and again throughout the discourse: do not be afraid. Watch. Stay awake. To understand the weight of those instructions, you have to understand what fear actually looked like in first-century Judea. Not as an emotion, but as a social and material condition. Fear in that world had texture. It had specific shapes. A farmer in Galilee feared the loss of his land, not to dramatic seizure, but to the slow mechanism of debt. Roman taxation ran at roughly 25 to 30% of agricultural production when all levies were combined. In a good year, a family with sufficient land could manage. In a bad year, drought, locusts, disease in the livestock, they could not. They borrowed. The lenders charged interest. The debt grew. The land, which was not just property but identity and inheritance, and the concrete promise of God to the ancestors, slipped away. Men who had been landowners became tenant farmers on land their fathers had owned. Tenant farmers became day laborers. Day laborers stood in the marketplace at dawn, hoping someone would hire them before the day was gone. Jesus had told a parable about exactly this. Men hired at different hours of the day, some waiting until the 11th hour, the last hour before evening, before anyone came to employ them. The parable is usually read as being about grace and fairness and the generosity of God, and it is. But it is also a precise social document. Those men standing idle in the marketplace at the 11th hour were not lazy. They were desperate. They had been standing there since sunrise. No one had wanted them. And in a world without savings, without a social safety net, without anything beyond the next day's wages, standing between a family and hunger, a day without work was not an inconvenience. It was a small catastrophe. This is the world whose fear Jesus addressed when he said, "Do not be afraid." The woman with 10 silver coins who swept her whole house searching for the one she had lost. This was not a story about mild inconvenience. A silver drachma was roughly a day's wage for a laborer. Losing 1/10 of your liquid savings was a genuine crisis. The lamp she lit to search by, the broom she used to sweep every corner, these were not casual gestures. They were the actions of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. And when she found it, the celebration with her neighbors was genuine, disproportionate, the relief of someone who had been holding their breath. Jesus placed the joy of God at the finding of a lost sinner inside this exact emotional register. Not the mild satisfaction of recovering something misplaced, the shaking, gasping relief of a person who had been staring at disaster and then watched it recede. By midweek in Jerusalem, the people around Jesus were living inside that kind of tension continuously. The pilgrims who had walked for days to be present for Passover had left their farms, their workshops, their families. They had spent money they could not easily afford on the journey, on the accommodation, on the animals for sacrifice. They were tired and crowded and far from home. And the city they had arrived in was vibrating with a kind of expectation that no one could quite name. Something was happening, something involving this teacher from Galilee, who had entered the city on a donkey and turned over tables in the temple, who debated the authorities daily and won, who spoke about the kingdom of God as though it were not a distant promise, but an immediate reality pressing against the surface of the present moment. On Wednesday of that week, the Gospels record almost nothing. It is the quiet day, the still point at the center of the storm. This silence has puzzled interpreters for centuries. Some suggest Jesus rested in Bethany. Some suggest events occurred that were not recorded. But perhaps the silence itself is significant. Perhaps after days of public confrontation and teaching, the Wednesday was a withdrawal, a gathering inward before what was coming. In Bethany, on one of the evenings of that week, a woman came to Jesus with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. Pure nard, a fragrance imported from the mountains of northern India, worth approximately 300 denarii, nearly a full year's wages for a laboring man. She broke the jar and poured the perfume over his head. The disciples were indignant. The waste was staggering. That money could have been given to the poor. Their reaction was not unreasonable. It reflected the values Jesus himself had taught. But Jesus stopped them. He said she had done a beautiful thing. He said she had anointed his body for burial. He said that wherever the gospel was proclaimed, what she had done would be told in memory of her. She is not named in Matthew or Mark's account. She acted out of something that went beyond calculation. And in that single gesture, the breaking of the jar, the scent filling the room, the oil running over his hair and face and shoulders, she did what the disciples had not yet been able to do. She accepted what was coming. She prepared him for it. She grieved before the grief arrived. The scent of that nard would have lasted. It does not wash out quickly. He would have carried it with him through the rest of the week, into the upper room, into the garden, perhaps even to the cross. Also that week, in the city, in the chambers of the high priest's household, a meeting was taking place. The chief priests and the elders had gathered to discuss the problem of Jesus. The word they used in their deliberations, according to Matthew, was doulos, cunning, treachery, deceit. They wanted to arrest him by stealth because they feared the crowd. A public arrest during Passover, when the city was full of Galilean pilgrims who had been following him for years, risked triggering exactly the kind of uprising they were trying to prevent. They needed someone on the inside, someone who knew his movements, someone who could tell them where he would be when the crowds were not around him. And then Judas Iscariot came to them. The Gospels record this without extended commentary. He came. He asked what they would give him. They counted out 30 pieces of silver, the price, according to the book of Exodus, of a slave accidentally gored by an ox. A precise, deliberate insult encoded in the amount. And from that moment, Judas began looking for an opportunity to hand Jesus over. The machinery of the execution had begun to move. And it moved quietly in the same city where thousands of pilgrims were preparing to celebrate the liberation of their ancestors from slavery. The irony was total, and it was invisible to almost everyone. Thursday arrived the way the end of things often does, quietly, without announcing itself, looking almost like any other day. The pilgrims in the camps on the Mount of Olives woke before dawn and rebuilt their fires against the cold. The city gates opened. The smell of bread baking in the clay ovens of the lower city drifted through the narrow streets. Water sellers were already moving through the alleys with their heavy skins, calling out their prices. Somewhere in the temple precincts, the morning sacrifice had already been prepared. A lamb, unblemished, offered at dawn as it was offered every morning of every year. The smoke rising in a straight column in the still air. The priests moving through their assigned roles with the precision of men who had done this 10,000 times. It was the 14th of Nisan, the day of preparation for the Passover meal. Before sunset, every household in Jerusalem that intended to celebrate the Seder would need to have its Passover lamb slaughtered, its unleavened bread prepared, its bitter herbs arranged, its table set. The slaughter of the Passover lambs in the temple began in the early afternoon and continued for hours. Thousands of animals. The blood channeled away through the temple's drainage system into the Kidron Valley below. The priests passing the blood in golden bowls down the line in a chain that moved without stopping until every animal had been offered. Into this day, Jesus sent 2 disciples, Peter and John, according to Luke, with precise instructions. Go into the city. A man carrying a water jar will meet you. Follow him. He will lead you to a house. Tell the owner that the teacher asks, "Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" And the owner will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Every detail of this instruction matters when you understand the world it inhabited. A man carrying a water jar in first-century Jerusalem was unusual enough to serve as an unmistakable signal. Water carrying was almost exclusively women's work. Women moved through the city's streets each morning with jars balanced on their heads or carried on their hips, going to the public cisterns and wells and returning with enough water for the day's needs. A man carrying a water jar would have stood out immediately. This was either a prearranged signal, a member of Jesus's wider network of supporters who had agreed to play this role, or it was something stranger and more deliberate, a sign chosen precisely because it could not be missed or confused with anything ordinary. The upper room itself speaks to social geography. Jerusalem's houses in the first century were built vertically on the slopes of its hills, ground floor used for animals and storage, middle floors for living, upper rooms reserved for guests or for the family's most private occasions. An upper room that was already furnished and ready during Passover week, when every room in the city was occupied, meant that someone had held it. Someone had made a decision not to rent it to the pilgrims flooding the city, to keep it available. This was a deliberate act of loyalty, performed at real economic cost by someone whose name we do not know. The anonymity of that loyalty is one of the quiet truths of the Passion narrative. Everywhere around the visible story, unnamed people made decisions that allowed it to unfold. The owner of the donkey, who let it go without question. The owner of the upper room, who held it in reserve. The women who funded the ministry from their own resources. The man with the water jar who walked through the city streets, carrying something men were not supposed to carry, so that 12 tired men from Galilee could find their way to a table. They gathered at evening. The Passover meal began after dark, as Jewish days did. The new day starting not at midnight, but at sunset, as it had been described in Genesis. Evening and morning, one day. The room would have been lit by oil lamps, small clay vessels with a wick floating in olive oil, giving off a warm, unsteady light that made the shadows move on the walls. The table was low, and they reclined around it in the Roman fashion that had become standard, even among Jews who resented Roman culture, leaning on their left elbows, eating with their right hands, positioned in a way that signified freedom. Slaves ate standing, free people reclined. The posture of the Passover meal was itself a statement. We are no longer slaves. The meal had a liturgy. The head of the household, in this case Jesus, led the group through the Haggadah, the telling of the Exodus story. The bitter herbs were eaten, the unleavened bread explained, the Passover lamb interpreted. 4 cups of wine were shared at specific moments in the meal. The youngest person present was supposed to ask the question that opened the telling, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" It is not recorded who asked it that night. Perhaps no one needed to. Perhaps the question was already present in the room without being spoken. At some point during the meal, Jesus took the bread. He gave thanks. He broke it, the gesture of a host distributing food, familiar from 1,000 shared meals. And he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in memory of me." Then the cup, after they had eaten. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." The disciples heard these words at a Passover table, inside a meal whose entire architecture was about remembrance and redemption. The Exodus lamb had been killed so that the blood on the doorposts would cause death to pass over the houses of Israel. The meal was a memorial of that night, a ritual re-entry into the founding moment of the nation's liberation. And now Jesus was placing himself inside that structure, not replacing it, but fulfilling it, extending it, reorienting it entirely around his own person. They did not fully understand it. The gospel accounts make this plain. Even at this moment, Luke records, the disciples were arguing about which of them was the greatest. Jesus responded not with anger, but with a kind of patient exhaustion. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority call themselves benefactors, but not so with you. The greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules should be like the one who serves. Then he got up from the table. He took a basin and a towel, and he washed their feet. Foot washing in the first century was not a symbolic gesture performed in a liturgical context. It was a necessary hygiene practice in a world where people walked everywhere on unpaved roads, wearing open sandals. Feet were dirty. They arrived at every house dirty. The washing of a guest's feet was a service so basic and so demeaning that rabbinic tradition held that a disciple should not wash his teacher's feet. It was the work of a slave or a servant, not of a student in relationship with a master. Peter refused. Jesus told him that if he did not wash him, Peter had no part with him. Peter then asked to be washed entirely. Jesus said that was not necessary, only the feet. The exchange between them contains, in miniature, the entire theological argument of the week. Peter wanted the version of Jesus that he had constructed in his own imagination, the king, the liberator, the restorer of Israel's greatness. The version of Jesus that was now kneeling on the stone floor with a basin of water and a servant's towel was not the version Peter had signed up for, and Jesus was telling him gently and absolutely that there was no other version. This was it. The basin and the towel were not a detour on the way to the throne. They were the throne. After the meal, they sang a hymn, the second half of the Hallel, the collection of psalms sung at Passover, Psalms 115 through 118. Psalms about trust in God when surrounded by enemies, about the stone rejected by the builders becoming the cornerstone, about giving thanks in the gates of righteousness, about the steadfast love of God that endures forever. They sang these words, and then they walked out into the night. The city around them was still alive. Passover night was not a night for sleep, but for eating and reciting and remembering. Lamplight came from every window. Voices carried across the rooftops. The smell of roasted lamb was everywhere. They moved through these streets toward the eastern gate, across the Kidron Valley Brook and up the slope of the Mount of Olives to a garden called Gethsemane, the name meaning oil press, a place where olives were crushed to extract what was inside them. Jesus asked the disciples to sit and wait while he went further in to pray. He took Peter and James and John with him deeper into the garden. And there, according to Mark, he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. He said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He asked 3 times for the cup to be taken from him. 3 times he returned to find his closest disciples asleep. The night was cold, the prayers were not answered in the way he asked, and at the end of the 3rd prayer he stood and said, "Enough. The hour has come." Judas was already at the garden gate with the soldiers. What followed, the arrest, the trials, the denial, the silence of Friday morning, the execution, belongs to the hours after the week's final night had broken open. But the week itself, those 7 days from the entry on the donkey to the garden in the dark, was already a complete human document. A record of what it costs to live without compromise, inside a world built on power and fear and transaction. He had walked into a city that was not safe. He had taught in a temple controlled by men who wanted him dead. He had eaten at a table where one of his own companions had already agreed to betray him. He had washed feet that would run away from him before morning. He had prayed alone while his friends slept. He had asked for the cup to be removed, and he had drunk it anyway. This is what Holy Week actually was. Not a pageant, not a liturgical performance. A human being, fully inside the anguish of human existence, moving towards something that no one around him could yet see clearly. Not the disciples, not the crowd. Not the authorities who arrested him and the governor who sentenced him. He was not carried to the cross on a wave of divine serenity. He was carried there through exhaustion, through betrayal, through the particular loneliness of a person who understands something that everyone around them has not yet grasped. And that is precisely why it means what it means. Not despite the cost, but because of it. The faith that emerged from that week was not built on a doctrine formulated in a quiet room. It was built on ground soaked with the reality of a God who did not watch human suffering from a distance, but entered it completely. Walking the same road, breathing the same smoke, sleeping under the same cold sky, praying in the same dark. That is the God the Gospels are trying to show us. And Holy Week is the week that shows him most clearly.